In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls out a group of people called the Pharisees. This comes from the Hebrew word Peruism, meaning separated ones or separatists. They also came from the school of Hasidim, meaning godly people. Now, this makes a lot of sense because they lived after the exile. What is the exile? Well, the exile was one of the most difficult and darkest times in all of Israel's history. See, remember, Israel had 44 kings, and most of these kings disobeyed God and led Israel away from God. And so as punishment, God used the Assyrians in 722 BC and take over the northern kingdom, and the Babylonians in 586 BC to take the southern kingdom into exile. So now God's people became Babylonian slaves, and they longed to return to the promised land. So God now has punished and purifies his people and sends a group back to the promised land, now freed from the exile. And while they're back home, they remembered why they got into exile in the first place. It was because of disobedience from God. So this makes sense that after the exile, now they want to take God seriously. Now, since the Pharisees were so passionate in their desire to obey God's law, they had developed over time an oral tradition called the tradition of elders that put a hedge or put a fence around the biblical commandments. The idea was that obedience to the tradition of elders, it formed this barrier that would prevent a pious Jew from breaking a biblical commandment itself. So here's an example. The 10 Commandments tell us that we must rest on the Sabbath. And so what they did was they actually created 39 categories to define work, and in doing so, they created hundreds of laws. Now, this may sound okay, but they had a problem with Jesus healing on the Sabbath because it broke one of their man-made laws. And because of their man-made laws, they were not fair, you see. See what I did there? They weren't fair, you see. All right, let me explain it. The Pharisees became legalistic and they forgot God in the process. So their spiritual practices, it looked holy, but actually they were bankrupt. And this is why Jesus clashed with them, and he even called them children of Satan and hypocrites, like in Matthew 6. After all, a hypocrite was simply an actor. So Jesus is calling these Pharisees actors, and their spirituality is just simply a fake mask. See, it's easy to fall into the trap of legalism and hypocrisy, and honestly, I think that American Christianity can learn a lot from Jesus' words to the Pharisees, but that's another video, so there you go. A little bit about the Pharisees, and that's enough today for our historical minute.